In this video, I will teach you step by step how to create lo-fi drums. This is a very beginner-friendly tutorial and I'm going to talk about things that I wish I would have known when I started making music. I will now quickly play the end result so you can hear what we're going to make in this tutorial. Okay, let's get started. Before we can arrange our beat, we need to select samples we want to use, and there are 3 different ways you can add samples to your project. I'm using Cubase myself, but these methods apply to pretty much any DAW. First method is dragging and dropping samples to your sequencer. In Cubase, this creates audio track, and in here you can see the waveform of the sample, you can reposition your sample, you can change its length, or you can add fade in or fade out. The advantage of this method is that you can easily see where your sample ends. This isn't always the case when using MIDI tracks, which takes us to the second method. You can also add samples using a sampler track. In Cubase, you can right-click a sample and select Create Sampler Track. This creates a MIDI track. So now you have to open up a piano roll, and in here you can draw notes to add samples. By default, your sample's normal pitch is in C3. You can also change the sample by just dragging and dropping a new sample to the sampler. The disadvantage of this method is that you cannot see the tail of the sample here. You see, when this MIDI note ends, it triggers a release of the sample, so there can be sound even after this MIDI note ends. So you have to be careful that your kick's tail doesn't bleed over to your snare, for example, because typically kick and snare are the loudest sounds in your lo-fi track and you don't want them to play together at the same time. However, the advantage of this method is that you can program your drums once, then just keep swapping samples until you find satisfying sound. Third method to add samples is using a drum sampler. The name might be a little bit different depending on which DAW you use, but basically it's a sampler that can hold multiple samples, and each sample is assigned to a different key on the piano roll. In Cubase, there's Groove Agent that does exactly this. This also creates a MIDI track for us, and now we can program our whole drum loop in one piano roll. So I'm gonna lay down some basic pattern here quickly for demonstration purposes. Now I can start dragging samples to the corresponding patch in Drum Sampler. If I want to edit properties of one sample, I can do it by selecting its pad, and now on the right side I can see its properties. If I want to change kick's amplitude envelope, for example, I can do it right here. You might already see the advantages and disadvantages of using a drum sampler. There's only one track for all drums. If I were to add some processing here, it would be applied to all drums. It is possible to route samples to their own tracks, but that's advanced stuff and beyond the scope of this tutorial. However, the advantages of using a drum sampler is that you can very quickly swap samples until you get the sound that you like. Drum samplers are also a way to go if you're a good finger drummer. I'm not. Okay, now that we know how to add samples, we can start arranging our beat. First you have to know what are beats and measures. Our time signature is 4x4 and this is default in all DAWs. And almost all lo-fi tracks are in 4x4. So for now, you don't need to worry about understanding or changing the time signature. Next, if you look at the top of your sequencer, you will see the numbers that indicate measures. They can be also called bars, it's the same thing. And with 4x4 time signature, we have 4 beats in 1 bar. So this area inside my loop markers is 1 bar or 1 measure, whatever you want to call it. And these 4 vertical lines are beats. So there are 4 beats in one bar. Now at this point you also want to make sure that your BPM is suitable for a lo-fi beat. I typically use something between 60 and 90. For sad, mellow or study vibe you might want to go slow. But if you want more upbeat and uplifting feel-good vibe, a little bit faster BPMs work better. I'm gonna use 75 for now. It's a good starting place. To get things going, I create 3 sampler tracks. One for kick, one for snare, and one for closed hi-hats. I use 16th note grid, meaning that one measure is divided to 16 segments. I start with the most basic pattern there is. One kick on the first beat, another kick between third and fourth beat. This position is also called off beat. Then I add snare on second and fourth beat. For closed hi-hat, I add 2 of those per beat. Now let's drop in some samples and try to find ones that work together well. I will also adjust volumes a little bit so we have some headroom in our mix. You should constantly check your meters. You don't want to go over 0 dB on your master channel because that's when you're starting to get distortion. Now that I have found samples that I like, it's time to add some variation to the beat. I'm going to duplicate this 1 bar loop and turn it into a 4 bar loop. I will create some variation to kick pattern so each of these bars inside loop is a little bit different. I will also add some extra snares. There are no rules here. I suggest you just try different sample positions and listen what sounds good. You can probably find some drum patterns online, but I recommend that you do this by experimenting yourself. In that way, you'll learn faster what works and what doesn't. Okay, I like the pattern now, but it sounds a little bit robotic, doesn't it? Next, we need to add some human feel to it. And we can do that by adjusting sample velocities, positions and lengths. Velocity is basically just the volume of the sample. First, I will set these secondary kick velocities a little bit lower. For the snares, I like to keep these main snares at normal velocity, but I will change these extra snares a little bit lower. Then let's move on to hi-hats. If I have a hi-hat pattern like this, I typically make offbeat hi-hats a little bit lower on volume. Now I just randomly change some velocities here. And let's copy this modified 1 bar hi-hat pattern across the whole loop. Next, I want to adjust sample positions and lengths because no human can play exactly on grid. I'm gonna apply swing to my grid for guideline. Swing basically delays your offbeat notes depending on your selected grid. I will use 16th note grid and swing maybe to, let's try 70%. Now when I start moving samples around, I'll take my snap to grid off. I will now make sure these hi-hats are hitting same time with the snare and kick. Okay, I think now this beat has a little bit more groove and it sounds more human. Now we have a solid foundation for our beat. Let's try to make it even more interesting by adding some extra percussions. One very common thing to do is to replace some closed hi-hats with open hi-hats. I will create a new sampler track for open hi-hat and try to find suitable sample. Okay, I like the sound of that. Another thing that I try often is adding shakers, so let's create a new sampler track for that. I have no certain pattern in my mind, it's just trial and error. Important thing here is to play with the velocities and sample positions. I don't always use shakers, but for this beat I think it works well. And instead of shakers, you can also try tambourine or other percussions. It depends on the vibe you're going for. Don't be afraid to try different things. Next, we could try adding some foley sounds. Those can really bring life and more organic vibe to the beat. Let's try dropping some here. You also might want to keep these foley sounds quite low on volume. You probably see here that with foley sounds I try to fill in these gaps. And you also don't want the same foley sound repeat too often, so hearing it once or maybe twice in 4-bar loop is enough. Another cool way to use foley sounds is creating a drum sampler track and drop a couple of different samples in there. And now I could try to make foley percussion loop with these sounds. I'm cutting some low end here so it doesn't interfere with the kick. Sometimes these foley loops work, sometimes doesn't, but it's always worth the try. I think for this case I'm gonna leave it in for now. Okay, I really like this beat now, but there's still more we can do to make it sound even better. First I'm gonna apply EQ to all my tracks. Most of the samples have lots of unnecessary low frequency information, so I'm gonna cut that out so it doesn't interfere with our kick and bass. Since we are making lo-fi, it's also very common to cut some of those really high frequencies. I might also make my kick a little bit softer by lowering some mid and mid-high frequencies. Since we don't have any other instruments in our track, and I like the sound of this beat, there's really no point of doing more EQing at this stage. Once I add other sounds than drums, I might come back to drums and do more EQing depending on which sounds are interfering with each other. For now, I'm happy with the EQs and I'm gonna move to sidechaining. Sidechaining basically means just lowering sample's volume in relation to trigger sample. So I wanna sidechain all instruments that are playing at the same time with the kick. In this case, that would mean closed hi-hats, shakers, and this foley loop. I'm gonna add compressors to all of these tracks and select my kick for trigger. In Cubase, you activate sidechain from this button, and then you can select trigger from this list. So I'm gonna select kick for my trigger. Setting up sidechain might be a little bit different depending on your DAW, but I'm sure that all DAWs can do sidechaining in some way. You might have to use Google to figure out how to do it in your DAW. Now that I have selected trigger, you can see that this compressor starts working whenever kick hits. Next, I'm gonna adjust these settings a little bit. My typical settings for sidechain compressor is 4:1 ratio and quite fast attack and release. I also disable makeup gain. Then I adjust threshold and listen how much of gain reduction sounds good. At this point, you might want a solo kick and the sample you are trying to sidechain. There are no rules here, you just have to use your ears and try to find satisfying setting for each compressor. Okay, now this beat sounds even more uniform. Next we are gonna look into group processing. So I'm gonna create a new group channel for all my drums. I will also drop all my drums to folder to keep the project clean. Okay, my secret sauce here is free plugin by Cymatics called Origin. I'm gonna leave a link to this in description. In Origin there's one preset that always works on lo-fi drums really well. It's called Gritty MPC Drums. This adds a little bit of saturation and crackle to the beat and also lowers the sample rate of the beat. Next I'm gonna add compressor to glue these drums together, and for that I will use Cubase's vintage compressor. If you're not using Cubase, don't worry about it, just experiment with whatever compressor your DAW has. I typically go with 4:1 ratio, quite fast release, and then play with the attack. Attack defines how much of the transients are coming through. Also, if you're using the same compressor, it's worth to try the punch button. I typically aim for 3 to 4 dB compression and then compensate gain with the output. So you have to increase input to get gain reduction and then compensate with this output knob. That's a very subtle difference, but I think it helps to glue drums together. Okay, one final thing that I will add is isotope vinyl. This is also a free plugin and I'm gonna leave a link in the description. What I like to do with this is use quite extreme settings and then automate its bypass so I can have it on track's intro, for example. or I can use it as effect when moving to a different section of the track. Okay, that's our drum loop and I like it a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to ask anything in the comments. Or if you have any tips of your own, don't hesitate to share them. I'm here to learn as well. Thank you for watching and maybe consider liking and subscribing if this kind of content is helpful for you. I'm also planning to do a whole series of these lo-fi tutorials, so see you in the next one.